Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, today I'm checking out a video from my friend Mr. Beat, and he just put out a popular video on the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is something we've been talking about in my classes recently, so I'm very much into the topic at the moment, and I'm always looking to learn more. By the way, Mr. Beat and I got together a couple weeks ago, and it was fun because we got to film some on-site content that he's going to be using for a future video that he said will probably come out later in the summer. So keep an eye out for that. All right, original video is down below. He's a big supporter of me covering his videos. And by the way, congratulations to him. He just hit 1 million subs. And what an incredible feat coming from a history teacher. All right, let's get started. Okay, here we go.
I'm Mr. Beat.
Hey, man.
It's okay. You can come a little closer. Okay, that's too close. Too close. Much better. Anyway, when I was 18 years old, I had to register for the draft. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the draft, aka military conscription, is the process in which all male American citizens have to be ready to become soldiers and fight in a war, whether they want to or not. Indeed-a-roo, all American males aged 18 to 25 must register with the Selective Service System in case the country goes to war and runs out of voluntary soldiers.
A lot of people might be like, I'm not gonna, because a lot of times it happens with while you register to vote. Still a very controversial thing, the idea of conscription. It's happened a handful of times in the United States with the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, and then with Vietnam. Every single time has always been considered controversial, right? Do you think that is something that should be required by law for somebody to give military service? What do you think? Provide some good debates when I talk about my class, but let me know down below.
The last time there was a draft, 1973. My dad missed the draft by 3 years. I missed the draft by 26 years. But my dad volunteered.
Mrs. Beat's great, by the way. Follow her on Twitter. Super smart, funny. She's awesome.
Volunteered to become a soldier, serving in the Army. In my opinion, he timed it pretty well, joining the Army about 1 year
I just love the name tag. Just Beat. Heck yeah, let's go.
after a particularly horrendous war ended that killed as many as 3.8 million people, including 58,220 Americans. It was a proxy war, or a war.
Can anyone tell me with that, does that include the deaths in Cambodia with the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Because that, I mean, devastating, it destabilized the whole country, paved the way for the Khmer Rouge, which is a dictatorship that is going to come in and kill and lead to the death of a quarter of their entire population.
Including 58,220 Americans. It was a proxy war, or a war in which two major powers used too much smaller powers to fight
Popular in
against
the
each other
Cold
in
War.
order to avoid fighting each other directly.
Very popular in the
It was a
Cold War.
war that not only divided a country, but divided the world. It was so controversial that it was the first war to cause a significant number of Americans to literally stop trusting their own government.
That was one of the big
and
effects.
almost single-handedly destroyed the reputation of this guy. It was the first war the United States clearly lost.
And it's interesting because the Vietnam War went through multiple presidents of different political parties, right? You got involvement starting really with the United States, helping the French, who were trying to hold on to Vietnam as a colony, right? Trying to regain control of that as a colony as they had lost it in World War II because Japan took it over. France wants to come back, right? The Vietnamese say, no, please, no, no. And the Americans are actually going to help fund and actually support, give a lot of the arms, ammunition and stuff that was used, especially at the end of the conflict when both sides were trying to really get some leverage going into Geneva Conventions to kind of end it. And that also turned the tide with Vietnamese support for the Americans, because during World War II, the Vietnamese loved the Americans. They had helped sort of liberate them from the Japanese. And if you know the whole story, we'll see how much he gets into it. But, you know, Ho Chi Minh, kind of their independence leader, was such a fan of the United States. And then, of course, that changed when the U.S. started supporting France. And that led to the death of Vietnamese and the Americans, of course, coming in. But I'm sure he's going to get to all this stuff. But I just wanted to note that he was saying how it really kind of, you know, ruined LBJ or something like that. And it's going to continue on, you know, through multiple, you know, you got Nixon after, but also it was going on before him as well. It was something that was like apolitical and it was bipartisan in the United States. So was the entire Cold War. It was a bipartisan thing. communism bad.
Here's the story of the Vietnam
anyway.
War, arguably the most controversial war in American history.
Yeah, I'd say it's, yeah, definitely. I know he had, by the way, please support him. I know he had, and YouTubers are having a hard time covering wars and having it not get age restricted, demonetized, here on YouTube. I know it's a touchy issue for YouTube. It's a very debated issue, but please support your content creators, especially in the alternative ways that you can help support them. Become channel members of their channels. If they have, things like Patreon, support them, because it's been really difficult lately to get good content out that YouTube views as advertiser friendly.
Once upon a time, there was a group of people called the Vietnamese who lived here in mainland Southeast Asia, an area commonly referred to as
on the East Coast,
Indochina.
Eastern Coast.
Eventually, the Chinese began to influence and straight up take over much of the area. Flash forward to the...
But repeatedly failed. One thing that's incredible about Vietnamese history is their ability to defend themselves against foreign invaders. They had done it against China. China really at best is going to, create a tributary state. You got like Tang China, by the most militaristic of the dynasties of China. Get that. Mongols couldn't do anything there. We talked about the French, the Japanese, like all of this stuff just repeated. Their whole identity has so much been around resistance to foreign powers and how successful they've been.
1800s, and France had conquered the area and maintained full control of it until World War II. Most people don't know that the Vietnam War was actually 3 separate wars that began right after World War II ended. But I'm a bit ahead of myself. By the 1930s...
Should I get actually on it and be like, is it 4? Is it like France, Japan, France, the United States? Anyway.
Several Vietnamese were just sick and tired of French rule, and various revolutionary groups organized to plan to overthrow French rule. One such group was the Viet Minh, who not only pushed for Vietnamese independence from the French, but also the Japanese, who are now all up in Southeast Asia's business.
Right? Remember the whole greater sphere of Asian prosperity that the Japanese proclaimed, that they had taken over these places in China, Philippines, Southeast Asia to liberate them from Western imperialism by doing their own brand of brutal imperialism. 2 wrongs trying to make a right, I guess.
Ah, yes, the Viet Minh, a group of communists led by a dude named Ho Chi Minh. He had been exiled from mainland Southeast Asia for most of his life, but now was
real
back,
name's different,
baby,
by the way.
trying to lead a revolution inspired, at least partially, by the United States.
Yep. He loved U.S. history.
Throughout World War II,
dude loved like George Washington. He had the Declaration of Independence like framed on his desk. Loved American history and really tried to portray the Vietnamese history like Americans, where it's like you have this foreign oppressor and they want independence and all this stuff. And yeah, he's inspired by that and wanted to appeal to the Americans based off of what he believed is a similar shared history.
The Viet Minh had got aid from the United States as well as the Soviet Union and China. American President Franklin
because all enemies of Japan
was a big supporter of Vietnamese resistance and argued Vietnam should be given independence after the war was over. Well,
this is why they loved it.
FDR died.
But remember, at this time, the argument was for independence. And then that argument is going to be transformed after World War II, where the focus won't be on Vietnamese independence, but communism. Can't drop the C word after the Cold War. You instantly become an enemy.
And after the war ended, the French did not grant Vietnam independence, and this led to,
they wanted it back.
Yeah, another war. Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces went underground to fight.
Literally.
Quite literally, actually, because they didn't have the same advanced weapons the French had. They dug tunnels underground as part of their broader strategy of conducting guerrilla warfare, or a war fought by unconventional means.
Yep. Usually common when you don't have the forces that can match, a standing army toe to toe. Very common. Also can be very effective. I mean, so much of the American Revolution, again, was a, guerrilla warfare or guerrilla war. I don't know if I'll get to this later, but a stat I actually did not know that I came across recently from one of the other videos I've covered with Vietnam was that about 30% of the Americans, okay, that died in the Vietnam War, and maybe it's just casualties in general, so deaths plus injuries, were by booby traps, by traps of some kind of traps, right? And so, which is all a popular form of guerrilla warfare.
They often hid in the jungle and launched ambushes or surprise attacks from concealed positions.
Look at that geography.
By early 1946, French, Japanese, and British forces all teamed up to defeat the Viet Minh. But after the Japanese and British left, the Viet Minh started rebelling again. Not only that, they were recruiting, and their numbers were dramatically growing.
And obviously, it wasn't very hard to recruit. It's like, you don't like foreign oppressors? Join us. I mean, really.
So the French were eventually able to regain control.
And if you're the group that seems to be the most likely to win of different insurgent groups or whatever you want to call them, you're going to pick the one you think's going to win.
Of Indochina. For
Smart,
several years, the whole area was unstable, and hundreds of thousands of people died. Not only that, both sides committed a bunch of war crimes. This period came to be known as the First Indochina War, aka the Anti-French Resistance War.
Depending on which side you're on.
After it became clear that the Viet Minh were straight up communists, the United States was like, I guess we have to fight against you.
And that's the key to all of it. Now remember, this resistance movement is more about independence than it is about communism or whatever economic philosophy. You got to understand that means of production. Let's get philosophical here, right? Means of production. Obviously, with Vietnam, so much of that it's an agrarian society, right? Was owned and operated by a very small handful of elites. Okay, first at foreign, and then if it was to transfer, it would, how would you do that? Go into a peasant population of Vietnam. Right, a shift into sort of a capitalism is almost not feasible when you are a former colony. Okay, when the means of production has completely been created as such, where how do you hand it off to a population, to the highest bidder? What do you do when your whole population is a peasant, is a group of peasantry? Do you just hand it off to the small amount of native elites that are there? People aren't going to be down with that. And it doesn't seem like a transition. So to them, the shift of this economic policy to a communism was them, first and foremost, to get independence, but to get their resources and the value of their country to more people. That was the vehicle by which this was, and it was largely misunderstood by the United States and things like that, about what their actual deal with communism was.
And started secretly aiding the French. In the spring of 1954, the Viet Minh had a decisive victory over the French in what became known as the Battle of Dien Bien
This was the final one.
It was a huge morale booster for the Viet Minh and a major blow for the French.
So at this time, the peace talks were actually about to start to begin. But the idea was that either side, when you go into peace talks, you want to have leverage. So even though peace talks were approaching, it actually had some of the most violent fighting of the entire war. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I thought I heard a stat, something like around this time by the Battle of Diem Bien Phu, that the Americans were supplying something like 75% of the artillery and just the weaponry for the French at this time, which that's when you start to see the attitudes really start to change towards seeing the Americans as enemies now, when you saw them differently by that time. But yeah, it's in a valley, and which was a bad strategy. It's in a valley, and around Dien Bien Phu is like on the mountainside was the Vietnamese, and their hidden artillery, which is hidden so well, was just blasting the French. Way more Vietnamese actually died than French in this, but it was still seen as a victory because just how many people die is not the is not what just determines who wins a war, but it's about who was affected by that more, and it was the French.
By then, the United States was freaking out about communism spreading around the world, and many in the American government thought that they should send not only troops, but nukes to France to help them defeat the Viet Minh.
That was literally
Harry
something
Truman
proposed.
was president, the U.S. had a foreign policy of, quote, containment. It basically assumed that the Soviet Union would always be trying to expand its influence, and so the United States and other, quote, democratic countries had to do whatever they could to contain this influence. And
yeah, the whole like Truman Doctrine and all that stuff doesn't even necessarily state about communism. It's like if anything is to potentially like threaten democracies, but it was, you know, their barrier intervention, but essentially it was if communism is going to spread. And containment theory is the idea like Americans had come to term that communism is going to exist. Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, whatever, even China to that point, it was like, it's going to be communist. You're not going to be able to deal with that. You're not going to go like the MacArthur route, which is like he said, after they defeated Japan, let's go and literally like go into Korea or like, China, go into like Russia and just like nuke them. It was like, no, like no more war with that. Not with those nations. Contain it there. But if it's to spread, the U.S. will intervene. And especially in places that have any kind of interference with allies or American economic interests.
In other words, democracy good, communism bad, stop communism and spread democracy whenever possible. This thinking is ultimately what led to the U.S. fighting in the Korean War. It was a devastating war that ended in a stalemate. Actually, that stalemate is still in place today.
Technically.
Regardless, the U.S. had prevented South Korea from becoming communist, likely inspired by holding back the spread of communism on the Korean peninsula. The next American president, Dwight Eisenhower, warned that once one country, quote, fell to communism, that country's neighbor surely would, quote, fall to it next. There was even a name for that theory, the domino theory.
And it's completely hypothetical. This is where people have retroactively discouraged from like a philosophical level about getting involved in Vietnam is, and it's not even the fact that, okay, maybe communism does spread like you see in the dominoes there to these other countries, maybe even get to India or something like that, which was a non-aligned, country during the Cold War. But so first off, you'd have to, believe that is true if that happens. And second off, do you care if Southeast Asia adopts communist economic policies?
That said, Eisenhower didn't want to make the mistake again of sending in American troops on the ground to fight in proxy wars against the Soviet Union. Like Truman did in Korea? Nah, man. So while communism spreading across Indochina did freak Eisenhower out, he wasn't about to send troops there. However, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French were now looking for a way out. At the 1954 Geneva Conference, not to be confused with the Geneva Conventions, that's something entirely different.
Oh, yeah. I think I interchanged the words. My bad on that.
Diplomats from France, the Viet Minh, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and the United States all agreed to temporarily divide up Indochina.
Let's remember that was the answer to every question about former colonies of like World War II from Axis powers, and that there was, some kind of differing in opinion between, say, the Soviet Union and communism, and capitalism from the American perspective was just divide it in half, right? Just divide things in half. On paper, it looks great. Everybody that wants a certain different outcome can have it. You have it in Germany. They even did it in Berlin, inside of Germany, in Korea. Okay, you're going to see it in Vietnam, the Palestinian-Israel question after the British are going to leave and the end of the British mandate there, try to propose a two-state system. Like all this stuff was always trailed. And you notice with every single one of those, there was a conflict.
There you go.
India, Pakistan. Okay, there's another one. Okay, over 1 million people, up to 2 million people died during that partition.
A map of it. They created the country of Laos. They made it landlocked. How lovely. They created Cambodia. Hi, Cambodia. And finally, they created 2 Vietnams, divided at the 17th parallel. Up here, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, aka North Vietnam, and down here, the state of Vietnam, which eventually morphed into the Republic of Vietnam.
All of these are artificial borders borders that don't represent any kind of cultural or political boundaries, but are artificial, and that's always an issue.
AKA South Vietnam. There were supposed to be elections held in 1956 to create a unified Vietnamese government. Those elections never happened, and a big reason why they never happened was because of this dude, John Foster Dulles,
Dulles,
the U.S. Secretary.
He is a guy I've learned a lot. I did not know much about him, but I've been watching some things and reading some things about how influential this guy was in the government through the CIA. Holy cow, he is way more powerful than I thought anybody was behind the scenes. Maybe it's just
he objected to elections probably because he knew that any election would likely put communists in charge of all of Vietnam. Dulles' brother, Alan Dulles, who was in charge of the CIA at the time, then engaged in some
basically worked in tandem with each other. So basically you had this marrying of like executive power and the CIA. Basically the executive branch through his brother could go through the CIA and do state business in a underground, more secretive fashion through the arm of the CIA. I know that sounds like such a bad thing when you talk about separation of powers. Literally, they're doing that. The state and then our secret agencies combining in to basically one thing. And this was going on, and this happened all over the planet. This was not just with Vietnam here.
PSYOP. He spread propaganda that said the Viet Minh were persecuting Roman Catholics, saying stuff like they buried a priest alive. In response, hundreds of thousands of Catholics in North Vietnam fled to the south. The United States helped them flee. Hey, speaking of Catholics, No Din Diem,
this guy
who hated communists, proclaimed himself the first president of South Vietnam.
Americans love him because he's not a communist, and he was, I'm sure I'll get to it, absolutely brutal. And if you want to talk about being upset about religious persecution, we'll see if he talks about what they thought of Buddhists.
Okay. Diem held a referendum to see if he would be...
By the way, it was, I think, understood by the CIA too, with those elections that would happen, Ho Chi Minh probably would have won. He was pretty popular. And that was not something that the CIA or the American government was going to be okay with, was even if it is a democratic, fair election, the winner can't be a communist. Like, that's not doing democracy right?
Be president or not. And would you look at that? He got 98.2% of the vote.
Woo!
Wow, that's impressive. And even more,
and that's that's the Southern vote. That's not the whole unification vote. I was just mentioning.
He got 133% of the vote in Saigon. Ha.
Let's go.
Didn't know that was mathematically possible, but great job, Diem. Yeah, he would rule the country with an iron fist. Soon after taking power, he started a, quote, denounce the communists campaign, a campaign in which anyone who even slightly became associated with being communist or anti-Diem was arrested, tortured, or even executed. Yep, you could get the death penalty for just being a communist.
I wonder if he doesn't, I hope I can remember, talk about his wife. She was brutal too. This is also a point where the people that may have even had more sympathies somehow with the United States, that were still, if they had that at all at this time, especially down in the South, were starting to now get off that fence for like American neutrality or American support, because this is the Americans' guy. Like, this is their guy. And if this is who they're supporting and he's extremely unpopular, then by default the Americans will also be thrown in under that, or with him as well.
Despite being a corrupt dictator who basically persecuted anyone in South Vietnam who wasn't Catholic, the American government stood by him for several years. Meanwhile, in North Vietnam,
they'll back away later,
as well as other politicians, also often got, well, would you look at that, 99% of the vote. While the United States viewed Ho Chi Minh as a brutal dictator, to many Vietnamese, he at least looked like a better dude than Diem. Still, the North Vietnamese government
it's not that hard to look better than the other guy. You know what I mean? It's not even about loving the guy necessarily, but like, all right, you're less bad than the other guy, the douche and a turd sandwich.
Often seizing farmland and also executing at least thousands of those who went against them.
Anti-revolutionaries, you know.
By the end of the 1950s, there was a new rising movement against the South Vietnamese government, much of it within South Vietnam. But it also grew in nearby Laos and Cambodia. It was called the Liberation Army of South Vietnam. But newspapers
It's pretty hard. You got enemies within your own territory.
Which is shortened from Vietnam Cong San, which translates to Vietnamese communist. The Viet Cong got support from North Vietnam, especially after North Vietnam invaded Laos.
See, this is where the whole splitting of things doesn't always get you the result that it's just going to be, all right, obviously everybody below this area is going to think and act this way, and then everybody's going to up north is going to do that way. It's like, no, you add communists in the South, and obviously their platform is going to grow if the people in charge there are not are doing bad. By default, you're going to default to the other side.
To help communists there. How did that support get down to the Viet Cong? Well, a network of roads and trails running through both Laos and Cambodia down to South Vietnam, simply referred to as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, made the Viet Cong stronger than ever. In 1960, a dude named Le Duan led North Vietnam, and he'd be more aggressive to South Vietnam than Ho Chi Minh ever was. Despite not wanting to send troops, President Eisenhower did send some military, quote, advisors, weapons, and money to South Vietnam.
They did,
but not much.
Fight, though.
And by the time he left office, it appeared that the United States may not stick around South Vietnam after all. But then this dude, wait a second, where's he at?
JFK's next.
Oh, there he is. But then this dude,
or it could have been Eisenhower's right-hand man, Mr. Nixon, but 1960 election goes very narrowly to Mr. Kennedy. But again, also showing here now that although, you know, you had Eisenhower was a Republican and he's going to be a Democrat, or Kennedy's a Democrat, that is a nonpartisan issue.
John F. Kennedy took over as president. Kennedy sent more and more military advisors, weapons, and money to South Vietnam, despite the French General Charles de Gaulle warning him that a war in Vietnam would lead the United States into a, quote, bottomless military and political swamp.
Even the French, they're like, dude, we tried this before. Don't do it. It's not going to end well. I know you have a little bit more military power here after World War II, but they're like, even the American allies are saying, don't do this.
Still, Kennedy thought it'd look really bad if South Vietnam fell to communism.
The United States has been assisting Vietnam economically to maintain its independence and viability, and also has sent training groups.
I love how old TVs look.
Have been expanded in recent weeks.
Like physically.
The attacks on the government and on the people of South Vietnam have increased. Now, this is a area where there is a good deal of danger, and it's a matter of information. We don't want to have information which is of assistance to the enemy, and it's a matter which I think will have to be worked out with the government of Vietnam, which bears the primary responsibility.
Don't talk about it.
On May 8th, 1963, more than 3,000 Buddhists gathered in Hue to protest a government ban on flying the Buddhist flag on the Buddha Day. South Vietnamese security forces fired guns and threw grenades at the protesters, ultimately killing 9 unarmed Buddhist civilians. This led to mass protests against Diem by Buddhists across the country. They asked Diem to give them the right to practice their religion freely, but Diem refused.
So this is also going to have international tension. It's also, going to bring a lot of negativity towards Diem and not look internationally when you're looking at it. If you're trying to like talk about different sides, you know, who's the better side, you know, of the two. This is really making the case very bad for the South here under this guy. But so if he gets to it, the Americans the dude ended up being so bad, even the Americans had to eventually pull support for him, and we'll see if he shows what happens to him.
Things got tense in Saigon, South Vietnam's capital, in June when Buddhist monks began burning themselves
Self-immolation.
alive. Here, in a photograph by Malcolm Brown, is the most famous example.
You guys know that the picture of the monk on fire, his wife had, Diem's wife had something to say. I want to see if he's going to say it, but if not, I'll chime in about her response to that.
Monk named Teek Quan Duke burned himself alive at a busy Saigon intersection. Many of you might recognize this picture from an album cover by Rage Against the Machine. President Kennedy later said that no photograph, quote, in history has generated so much emotion around the world as that one. Speaking of Kennedy,
Powerful photo. Okay. So Diem's wife, I don't remember her name, she was like just as aggressive and with her stance and her rhetoric as he was. Said something, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something on the lines of like, it was awful. It was in response to that self-immolation, the monk that burned himself alive. It was like, it was something on the lines of like, next time if they're going to do a barbecue, I'll make sure to bring something. It was like horrible. It was something like that. Like if they want to do another barbecue, I'll bring something to the party. When I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh.
I was about done with South Vietnam and Diem in particular. South Vietnamese generals told the Kennedy administration they'd be staging a coup or an illegal overthrow of a government of the Diem
Americans
regime.
were like, fine.
The Kennedy administration said they wouldn't stop them if they tried. On November 1st, 1963, they arrested Diem and assassinated him the next day. South Vietnam would have political instability for years afterward, led by a series of generals.
Dude was so bad the Americans didn't care.
There is substantial evidence that Kennedy was ready to get Americans out of Vietnam after this. But yeah, this didn't actually happen. Maybe it would have happened, but we'll never know.
It is interesting, like I found that it seems like there were like 10 different times that there was a pretty obvious and simple, I mean not simple, but like obvious time that the Americans could have and probably should have or would have, pull out of this. And they don't, for, whatever reason. It keeps going. And it's still interesting. It's still something I'm trying to, think through a little bit about what other elements are pushing this. Because it just seems like as you follow these stories, there's a handful of these events where it seems like, okay, this is the time the Americans would leave. You know what I mean? But there's something pushing. Right?
As Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd. I have an entire video about the assassination of JFK. Okay, you already know about the video. Great. But in case you don't know, check it out, maybe. But yeah, this led to Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, being sworn in as the next president. Johnson had little foreign policy experience. While he wasn't a big fan of American involvement in Vietnam, like Kennedy, he also thought it looked really
LBJ
bad.
was kind of came through the tree of FDR, of Roosevelt. So similar thoughts that way.
South Vietnam fell to communism, while he was cool with the U.S. government continuing to carry out more covert operations there. He was against sending ground forces. At least he didn't want to send ground forces yet.
That will change. I mean, literally not just ground forces, but a draft. So it's like what happens between then and now and then.
And Lyndon Johnson didn't want to appear weak on foreign policy, especially after his main opponent, Barry Goldwater, was talking trash about Johnson, saying that he was too weak against communism.
It's so interesting because it's like he's already so hard. I mean, again, it's nonpartisanship, but it's like these elections sometimes we're just like, who hates communists more? It's like we both hate communism, but like who hates them more? One of the most famous and interesting political ads you'll ever see is during that election. Barry Goldwater's look up, or he supported or whatever, I approve this message kind of thing. Look up the Daisy ad. And it's just like this little girl who's there, and then there's this countdown going on, and then a nuclear bomb goes off, or you know what I mean? And it's like know who you're voting for this election. So to go, to fight against the people that are egging on nuclear war.
So he put the pressure on North Vietnam by putting American ships all up in their business. On August 2nd, an American destroyer named the USS Maddox was hanging out off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin when it spotted North Vietnamese torpedo boats. It fired a warning shot, and the torpedo boats fired shots back at them. 2 days later, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox again.
That was the story.
Just kidding. That never happened.
It's
Here's
it's
the
controversial.
thing. The sailors on the USS Maddox thought they were being attacked, but nope, they weren't being attacked at all. Regardless, based on this made-up attack, President Johnson ordered an air attack on North Vietnamese naval bases and asked Congress to grant him the power to take any action necessary to fight back against North Vietnamese aggression and defend South Vietnam.
Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So literally this was like declaration of war, but gave the power to the hands of the president. But it happened as a result of this attack, right, on the Maddox. And that information, was spread to the United States, to Congress, that this was this like unprovoked attack by the North Vietnamese. And then before even the facts came out and things were investigated, that went to the vote, went to Congress. We know how this goes, right? You have an attack and it becomes very personal and clarifies an enemy and things like that. And it's so emotional. And when it goes to a vote very quickly, it's obviously going to get a lot of support. But yeah, come find out that event never happened. But nevertheless, it's like the egg has been cracked or whatever. The floodgates are open. You're not going to come back from this. War is on. The United States is putting boots on the ground.
Congress passed what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7th, 1964. The House passed it unanimously, 416-0. The Senate passed it 88-2. The only two U.S. senators voting against it were Wayne Morse and Ernest Greening, who said he didn't like, quote, sending our American boys into combat in a war in which we have no business, which is not our war, into which we have been misguidedly drawn, which is steadily being escalated.
It's such an amazing quote because so many people now, believe this. It shows you what the thought process and what things were like, here in the 1960s, right? It shows the Cold War hysteria and all that.
Johnson said the resolution was like, quote, grandma's nightshirt because it, quote, covered everything. He considered it a blank check to commit American forces to Vietnam. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, did he send American forces to Vietnam. Under the advice of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who also served under JFK, Johnson increased the number of military advisors in Vietnam to 23,000. And yet, Johnson, or LBJ as many call him today, assured Americans he wasn't going to send troops on the ground shortly before the election of 1964. Well, that all changed.
Because you got to understand politics is so important. So many things happen especially in an election year. They say economies are always really good during election years and stuff like that because you have to be in a good state, and legislation, even if it's only short term in its scope, if it is to temporarily help things like the economy or the state of a war, those become very important in election years and may not actually represent the long-term goals of politicians. But in a democracy where you have terms, people have to think about voting, and what's going to make them appealing to voters. And the economy and potential for war and having to go to war, it's kind of the top of the list, right? That people are most concerned about.
After the election was over, LBJ easily won the election. That was an understatement. It was the most lopsided presidential election in American history in terms of the popular vote. And shortly afterward, things began to quickly escalate.
Electoral ones.
After the Viet Cong attacked an American airbase at Pleiku, killing 8 Americans, Johnson ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign of North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder would continue for 3 years. During that time, the United States dropped around 800 tons of bombs a day on North Vietnam. And yet, it didn't seem to faze North Vietnam.
That's what's crazy about it. It's like there's more bombing going on in here than all World War II combined. And it still did nothing to get closer to victory in this war. It's like everything that might have been destroyed was just rebuilt. It was like so demoralizing for the Americans to have this, because this was like, the alternative to boots on the ground was, death from above. And when that becomes inefficient, or just like it doesn't reap any benefits, then what's left? Either you end the conflict or you have to go boots on the ground, and we know where this is going to be going.
Continued to aid the Viet Cong via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In order to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply route, the United States also bombed Laos, which itself was going through a civil war. Curtis LeMay, the chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force, wrote, quote, "We're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age." But all this bombing didn't seem to have much of an effect, as most of the bombs failed to hit their targets, instead falling into empty jungles. Not only that, Viet Cong guerrilla fighters just kept going underground anyway, building elaborate tunnels to shelter from the bombs. And so,
yeah, it's like what effect is bombing gonna have when your enemy is not above ground in those bombing zones? You know what I mean? Okay, you might blow up some farms. That's just going to create some famine or something like that, but everything just would get replaced, and it's like zero effective.
Johnson did what once was unthinkable. He sent ground troops. Like, a lot of ground troops. By the end of 1965, more than 184,000 American troops were now in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, more than 385,000. By the end of 1960.
See, this is where American public will start to care, because, like, for the most part, if it doesn't affect the American public directly, whether it's you or your loved ones, which the Vietnam War was not affecting people up to 1965. It's like people didn't really care. They're not going to clamor for it. You're not going to get nearly as much of the anti-war protest or affect elections or something like that. So you can see in 1965 with this now putting troops, now you're putting people there and you have those relationships with them. And then later we're going to get the draft. That's obviously going to enable the American public to have a stronger opinion on this war, whether it's a war hawk, as they called it, right, of someone that supported the war, or somebody that's more of a pacifist.
67, more than 485,000. By the end of 1968, more than 536,000. Holy dang. And in case you were wondering where these soldiers were coming from, many of them did not volunteer to go fight in Vietnam. They were drafted. Nearly 1.9 million men would be drafted to serve in the Vietnam War. Wow. Most of those drafted were poor. Rich people often found ways to get out of the draft. You know,
a lot of deferments.
Made up stories about medical conditions or went to college when they didn't have to. The American soldiers were originally supposed to train South Vietnamese troops, but
deferments, you could get that if you were well off. You know, college deferment or health deferment, get a doctor or something to get you out, you know, of it. President Trump has been criticized for that by basically getting deferment for, what was it, bone spurs or whatever it is. But yeah, it was the draftees were very much disproportionate towards people that weren't wealthy, right? Because, like, if you get a college deferment, well, guess what? You have to have money to go to college. So that's obviously going to help the wealthy and find other ways to do that. So yeah, very disproportionately fought by the poorer class of American citizens.
That was a disaster. The South Vietnamese soon were becoming more like spectators in their own war as Americans did more and more of the fighting.
The South could not fight on their own.
The commander of the American forces in Vietnam was General William Westmoreland, who hoped to take out both North Vietnam and the Viet Cong through a war of attrition, or a military strategy.
We know this doesn't work.
To simply wear down the enemy until the enemy loses their will to fight. But yeah, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong.
So that doesn't work so much when you are the defenders. It works really well if you're the offenders, if you're the invading force, you know, but it's not like you can give up when you are the losing force. It's like you're going to lose your country. For the Americans to pull out, it's like, okay, whatever, it's not going to change anything. But yeah, if you are defending, then war of attrition is not going to work. There's no other option but to fight, in their opinion.
Weren't about to lose their will to fight. In fact, as more Americans came, the Viet Cong recruitment numbers went up. Soldiers on both sides fought in some pretty miserable conditions. It was often rainy.
So bad.
When it wasn't rainy, it was humid.
Rain like every day for months.
Snakes, swarms of weaver ants with stinging bites, giant centipedes, crocodiles, tigers. Oh my! The Viet Cong didn't have the military technology of the United States, but they made their own bombs, set up booby traps, and hid in the jungle, waiting for American soldiers to fall in their traps.
Told you up to 30% of Americans that died were from traps.
Dense jungle foliage made it easy for the Viet Cong to camouflage not just themselves, but also their bases. They'd launch ambushes on American soldiers, then quickly retreat back into the jungle. To counter the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, General Westmoreland conducted search and destroy missions in villages, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Deadly.
Americans in low-flying helicopters would spray machine gun bullets over an area, and then ground troops would move in quickly to search out and kill the enemy.
And it's pretty much indiscriminate in a lot of ways too for what they do that, because it's like, it's okay, the Viet Cong and all this stuff, they're not a standing military that you can just identify in an open battlefield with what they wear and stuff. It's like they're indiscernible from civilian citizens. And, you know, the Americans are going to come in and be like, are you Viet Cong? And sometimes they don't know. And as the war got on, there was less and less like investigation of like trying to find evidence of who were enemy combatants and stuff. So it was just like end up killing a lot of people in general. But then, you know, you unfortunately for a lot of these people too, that these like civilians that wanted to stay out of it, if you wanted to, or whatever, whether you wanted to, you know, harbor Viet Cong soldiers or hold their supplies or something like that, they were under a lot of threat too, because, you know, Viet Cong soldiers out there hiding in the day and then come at night and come to these villages and basically tell the people, you know, force them to do the will of the Viet Cong, and, you know, under penalty potentially of death. So it's like, it was a lose-lose situation for civilians. Okay. You're going to piss off one side, and whether like every time, and both sides, if you piss them off, you're going to die. So what do you do?
Sometimes these missions took out Viet Cong bases. Other times these missions just destroyed villages and killed civilians who had nothing to do with the Viet Cong. This led to more and more villagers.
Want to help the Americans? You're an enemy of the Viet Cong. Want to help the Viet Cong? You're an enemy of the Americans.
Jungles that concealed the Viet Cong. The U.S. Air Force began spraying herbicides like Agent Orange to kill all vegetation. Sure, the herbicides cleared the jungles, but they also ended up later causing all kinds of health problems for people exposed to them.
Still happening. That we talk about, like, think of it in the same way as like radiation, you know, from atomic bombs can cause all kinds of long-term health effects that happen too for Americans as well. A lot of Americans are going to get cancers and stuff from Agent Orange. If they were somebody, a friend of mine, his father was a helicopter pilot and was part of that, and he actually died recently. You know, he's older now, but from cancer that they believe might have been from Agent Orange. So this killed Americans too.
During the war, the Air Force ultimately sprayed at least 19 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Even today, both veterans and regular folks in these countries are still suffering from the
including
effects
Americans
of herbicides. In particular, Agent Orange has put millions of people at a higher risk of getting cancer.
We have helped to build, and we have helped to defend.
Best friend's dad
Thus,
recently
over
died
many
from it.
years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise.
Publicly, Johnson was making it seem like, oh yeah, South Vietnam was going to be an independent country soon, any day now.
Such peace demands an independent South Vietnam.
But by 1966, many South Vietnamese soldiers had deserted the fight. To put it mildly, things were not going so well for the United States.
Americans are carrying the entire war right now. Now, I assume we get to it because it's a major part of like curriculums that we talk about, and it's the impact of television on war. The Vietnam War was really the first American war that, by this time, basically all Americans had televisions, okay, at this time, and that there was nightly coverage of the war on, you know, the nightly news nationally. And you had messages like this coming from the presidents, like LBJ, that, you know, of what the war is like, how the war is going. And it's always seen as it's going fine, and this is what the goals are and all that stuff. But then you would get a very different story on the nightly news, and it confused people and led people to, you know, believe with what they see and start to see the government a lot more as nefarious. And at the very beginning of the video, Mr. Beat was talking about how this war also triggered a legacy that is very common now in American society of distrust of the government. And Vietnam War was one of those catalysts for that.
Many around the world began to question why the heck Americans were even in Vietnam anymore. Some of the biggest protests were actually back home in the United States. Beginning in 1966, huge protests erupted on college campuses across the country. By 1967, these protests seemed to be everywhere. Some protesters were upset that the United States was bombing the crap out of an undeveloped country. Some protesters called it a war of imperialism. Many protesters said the war was simply not winnable. Other protesters just thought the draft was wrong. It became common to see young people burning their draft cards in protest. They particularly talked trash about the fact that rich and powerful people voted for the war while poor people actually fought it. A big reason why many Americans began to turn against.
And obviously it's going to happen for college students. You know, one of the biggest reasons is they're the draft age, right? Too. And yes, there are deferments and all that stuff, but still, you're very much, you know, as it goes on, it's gonna be harder and harder to defer from this, especially if you're just like an average Joe. Interestingly, along with this war too, and this makes sense too, this was the big push to lower the voting age, right? Original voting age was 21, and pushing it at this time to get 18 also has political motivations, because think about it. When it comes to the war and how you're going to vote in the war, what is more likely to come from the 18 to 21 demographic of voters about war issues? It's obviously going to be anti-war.
The wars because they saw what the war actually looked like in real time on TV. And it looked like a nightmare.
Yeah.
While the Johnson administration would give press conferences pretending everything was all gravy, news coverage on TV routinely showed children killed by American bombs and dying American soldiers. People weren't falling for what their government was telling them anymore. You know, it's kind of like the government telling you that there's no war crimes, and then you get on TikTok and you see the war crimes.
Right.
And then the government bans TikTok, problem solved. Anyway, it's important to recognize that many Americans still...
Or at least from, isn't it what they want to do though, is have it not be owned by like the Chinese, have it owned by another entity. It's like sell or be banned. Isn't that basically the talk right now?
Defended and supported the war effort. Those who became known as hawks wanted total victory in Vietnam, while those who wanted...
By the way, just because I'm going to forget, I covered a video that was debates between pro and anti-war people at this time. Hopefully I can try to remember to link it at the end there. And you can actually hear debates from people in a very civil manner, by the way. It was really good, about people talking about supporting or not supporting the war. I reacted to it. It didn't get a lot of views, so it probably has been buried. Maybe you never even saw that, but look up for that. I forgot what I even called it, but it's basically like, yeah, debate about the Vietnam War and me kind of reacting to it. So check that out too. I think you'll find it really interesting to hear arguments from people at that time.
War and bring the troops home became known as doves. It was arguably the first time the country was so divided on one particular issue, going back all the way to the American Civil War. Tragically, many of the Vietnam War veterans who did survive and came back home got no love. Many of these veterans had dads who returned home from World War II greeted as heroes.
This was so sad.
Vietnam War veterans were often not greeted at all when they got home. Anti-war protesters sometimes harassed them. They didn't spit on them, though. Apparently that's a myth. By the end of 19...
Yeah, I'm sure somebody did somewhere. That is something that unfortunately is tragic for the veterans of the Vietnam War. These people that got drafted and had to do horrible things and endure horrible things and stuff, not get that welcome and that badge of heroism, you know, like their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did in the world wars. That is always something that's been very sad.
1967, despite his impressive domestic accomplishments regarding civil rights and social welfare programs,
right. Great
President
society,
Johnson was not that popular anymore. They said, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
What's his?
Yes. They really shouted that.
Yep, that was a quote.
And yet, he insisted on finishing the job.
At protests.
Even as others around him now had doubts. One of those who had big doubts, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Once a big supporter of the war, he ended up resigning in protest of it. And spent the rest of his life saying the Vietnam War was a mistake.
It's amazing. The secretary, right in the cabinet, is like, I'm out. That's so wild to think about, isn't it?
War dragged on, with no clear victory in sight. And then, suddenly, on January 31st, 1968, which was the first day of Tet, the Vietnamese
Offensive.
New Year, both North Vietnam and Viet Cong forces launched a huge coordinated attack on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. All at once. It became known as the Tet Offensive, and it ended up being one of the biggest military campaigns of the war. The Tet Offensive was a rare time when both North Vietnam and the Viet Cong went on, offense, and it caught many Americans and South Vietnamese by surprise. In Hue, the same city where the Buddhist uprisings had taken place 5 years prior, intense fighting took place that destroyed most of the buildings there. While the United States and South Vietnam were eventually able to defeat North Vietnam and the Viet Cong during the Tet Offensive, it caused more people around the world to turn against the war.
This was the biggest effect of it, because like the message had been coming out of the government and the military that the Americans were first off, they were winning, and also that their enemy did not have the capabilities to do an offensive like that. And yeah, like it said, although it was a victory, right, for the Americans, they were able to withstand that attack. Its effectiveness was much bigger than anything strategic. It was maybe the final dagger for public opinion. Okay, this was it. It was like, maybe he'll get to Walter Cronkite, who like on air was like, when they were showing this, because he was like the trusted voice of America, right? The nightly news came out and was like, I thought we were winning the war, like coming out and saying it from the press box there. It's like, I thought we were winning the war. It's like, and all this stuff is saying otherwise. This was the dagger in a lot of ways for the war.
Poll showed that now just 26% of the public approved of how President Johnson was handling it. Based mostly on how badly the war was going, he decided to not commit more troops. Even though General Westmoreland had requested an additional 206,000 troops, Johnson also chose not to run for re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Two notable anti-war candidates ran to take his place for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Eugene McCarthy, a U.S. Senator representing Minnesota, and Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, and now U.S. Senator representing New York. After Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, he got assassinated too. Some of his supporters...
RFK was very popular. I've learned a lot more about how JFK very much listened to RFK, especially on policy issues. His brother, Robert, like he was very influential on his brother. He was like the first guy, John was like, Robert was the first guy John would look to for a lot of things, and very popular. He's going to get assassinated and probably would have won the election if he had not been assassinated.
Was assassinated on June 5th. He got assassinated too. Some of his supporters switched to support McCarthy. Despite McCarthy winning more votes than any other Democratic presidential candidate, the party elites went with Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, instead. This led to a bunch of anti-war Democrats getting pretty angry as Humphrey had supported continuing the war effort outside the
It's like there was no anti-war alternative at this time, because again, the political parties were just still so close. The political elites, even at this point, it's amazing. At this point
National Convention in Chicago, there were even violent confrontations between anti-war protesters and the police. Meanwhile, the Republican Party nominated Richard Nixon for president, the former vice president who once aggressively called for sending more troops to Vietnam and criticized Democrats for being too soft on Vietnam, but now was like, hey, I've got a, quote, secret plan
and expanded it even more.
The Vietnam War. Nixon also campaigned to end the draft. You could argue that this is one reason why he won the election of 1968. That said, after he took office, he didn't seem to be that much in a hurry to end the war. Besides, by that time, peace talks between North Vietnam...
It's so interesting because it's like whenever somebody gets... Okay, it's like they go into an election and they have their own thoughts about things. And then it's like, once you get in, it's like they're hearing new information. Other things are like pushing them around. And then like it'll change all of a sudden. It's so interesting to see that.
The United States had already begun in Paris anyway. After Nixon took over, he introduced a new strategy called Vietnamization, which basically meant gradually turning the war back over to South Vietnam. I mean,
It was never going to
that
work.
was going to be hard. At the time,
It was never going to work.
1 out of every 12 South Vietnamese lived in a refugee camp, for crying out loud.
Oh, wow.
In 1969, it had
Didn't know
become
that.
increasingly clear that the American government was covering up bad stuff its military had been doing in Southeast Asia.
My Lai,
Most
you talk about that?
infamously, what became known as the My Lai Massacre. It had occurred back in March 1968. American troops led by Lieutenant
that guy.
William Calley entered a small village called My Lai trying to find Viet Cong. Well, they
Remember, this is
didn't-
search and destroy. This is what was going on. This was how much of the fighting was done, was through the same way. I mean, these guys are going to go a little bit, further, but were there other instances like this that didn't get caught,
find any Viet Cong, but instead
So I'll hear that again.
Viet Cong. Well, they didn't find any Viet Cong, but instead they sexually assaulted several women and rounded up around 500 unarmed civilians, including mostly women, children, elderly men, and even babies, and brutally murdered them. And then the U.S. Army covered it up.
Yep.
It wasn't until November 1969 when word finally got out about it.
Press got to
Around
it.
that same time, Daniel Ellsberg published the Pentagon Papers, which
I'm waiting to see if he talks about what happened to Callie. If he doesn't, I'm going to try to remember to chime in because it's depressing.
revealed that the American military had secretly expanded military operations in Vietnam without telling the public or even Congress. Even though President Nixon wasn't mentioned in the Pentagon Papers, he viewed its release as an attack on his handling of the war. He made it a mission to take Ellsberg down. But
War against the press and all this stuff. Okay, so Callie ends up getting in trouble, and I forget the exact details of it, but essentially he was court-martialed or whatever, and total slap on the wrist for it. None of the soldiers got in trouble for it, okay, that actually carried out. And that's another subject of conversation, of debate about people giving orders versus people executing orders. But basically, like, the blame went to him. And then, if I want to remember, if I'm wrong down in the comments, but he got like a certain sentence, I think. And then it ended up turning into like nothing. I don't know if it was like house arrest, or it ended up being a slap of the wrist. So it was basically no accountability ended up happening from My Lai massacre.
But ultimately, most viewed Ellsberg as a heroic whistleblower, and long story short, he wouldn't see any prison time. While Nixon did begin bringing the troops home, protests continued as many Americans thought the process wasn't happening quickly enough. Plus, anti-war protesters got angry all over again after Nixon ordered American forces to invade Cambodia, an officially neutral country, on April 29th, 1970.
Now, remember he said Cambodia, right? So Ho Chi Minh Trail, it's how the Viet Cong gets their stuff, is through there. So they thought, for the effort of the war to improve the Americans, you had to go through Cambodia as basically a complicit participant of supporting the Viet Cong, even though Cambodians weren't fighting.
Nixon had not consulted Congress. At one of the protests on the campus of Kent State University in Kent, Ohio,
Massacre.
on May 4th, National Guard members fired shots into a rowdy student crowd, killing 4 and wounding 9. Today, this horrific event is simply known as the Kent State shootings. And I have a video I made about that as well, which you can check out. It got demonetized, as this video is demonetized because, I'm teaching you about bad stuff that happened in history. Despite growing pressure to end the...
Telling you guys, I said this earlier, you gotta be supporting your content creators. Otherwise, stuff like this is gonna stop being produced. Professional content creators like Mr. Beaton, you've heard from all the other ones, they talk about it all the time. Griffin over Armchair Historian and stuff like this, are going to be forced to not be able to make content like this unless you are directly supporting content creators. Do the channel subscriptions, okay? Because the big thing, YouTube talks about this. It's about, not about YouTube trying to like censor this stuff. That's not the case, because the videos still go up. But it's about their fear of videos not being ad friendly, that companies are not going to pay for advertising to have videos on subjects like this. Let's make that clear, because that's really the issue at hand here. So if they can't monetize this through ads, okay, because whatever YouTube decides about ad monetization with it, directly support the content creators, okay? So again, channel memberships. Basically, everyone has those now. The Patreon stuff too. So you can do that too. I have one, not trying to plug mine, but I have that too. And obviously anything that gets any of these videos that get demonetized, these original videos I comment on, obviously it happens for me too. But anyways, I want to make sure we get to that. But support these people. They have channel memberships. And
War
get a lot of
immediately,
benefits, so please support
Nixon
them.
insisted on peace with honor. He sent his national security
He
advisor,
just died.
Henry Kissinger, to secretly negotiate with the North Vietnamese government. Of utmost importance, getting the American prisoners
By the way, Ho
of
Chi Minh
war
died, was that 69? What year was that again?
released. By 1972, only around 24,000 American troops were still in Vietnam. Still, North Vietnam stayed aggressive, dropping
totally
a series of
overran it,
bombs
man.
on South Vietnam in what became known as the Easter Offensive. In response, Nixon ordered
Yeah, 69
more
he died.
bombings on North Vietnam. Regardless, Nixon easily won re-election in a landslide
Yeah, look at
victory
that, man.
in November. On January 27th, 1973,
It's interesting because it's like LBJ was so unpopular and wasn't going to get voted in for his next term and was continuing the war. But then so is Nixon, but he still gets a lot of popularity. It's amazing what it shows about this silent majority that's out there that aren't the loud people at protests that maybe still support the government's actions and are showing that in the voting booth.
in what became known as the Paris Peace Accords, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States finally negotiated an agreement calling for all American troops to leave South Vietnam in exchange for the release of American prisoners of war. But this peace agreement smelled much more like an American retreat. Meanwhile, Nixon had continued bombing Cambodia without
There's no
getting
leverage.
approval from Congress. This ultimately was a big reason why Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, a law passed over Nixon's veto that required the president to report to Congress within 48 hours after committing troops to a military action or substantially increasing the size of American combat units. The law also said troops couldn't stay in combat somewhere for more than 60 days without further congressional approval. And then on March 15th, 1973, Nixon was like, look, North Vietnam, if you attack South Vietnam again, the United States might just go to war with you again. Oh boy, well goodness. Anyway, by then, most Americans were out of
Good
South
threat
Vietnam.
to
By the end of 1974, North Vietnam was planning an attack on South Vietnam to completely take it over. Yep, in direct violation of the Paris Peace Accords. North Vietnamese troops moved.
They don't care. I mean, they don't care. The North Vietnamese aren't going to care here. This goes back to what it was going to be at the beginning, which was, you saw this in North Korea as well, that, you know, this side who feels to be a lot more of the legitimate power inside of the country that is least puppeted, I guess, feeling that they are the rightful torchbearers of this country. It happened in Korea. It's going to happen in Vietnam, both being the, you know, communist side, obviously, of this. And yeah, breaking rules. It's true with North Korea and with Vietnamese, the communist side broke international law with some of these. Of course, they never felt that those were valid in the first place, so that's another argument there, that all these were artificial things put on them when they had no leverage.
Moved into South Vietnam in March 1975 and captured Saigon on April 30th, 1975. The fall
Capital
of
of the
Saigon,
South.
as it became to be known, marked not only the end of the Vietnam War, but the end of South Vietnam as a country.
By the way, a very scary time if you were somebody that was an open supporter of the Americans at that time. As the Americans are leading, you're now in the hands of these, you know, Viet Cong or whatever, and things didn't go well for a lot of those people after the, you know, after this is over.
had taken over
No protection
all of
anymore.
Vietnam. Yeah, so was it worth it? Well, many say no.
mean, most say no. Yeah, legacy.
The Vietnam War was the longest war in American history up to that point, only surpassed by the war in Afghanistan in 2021.
Which people, Afghanistan, are people going to be talking about this the same way? Was it worth it? Happened for good reasons. Multiple times where Americans could have pulled out of the war, leaving the country in a very bad state for both everyone involved. By the way, Afghanistan too, it's like so many countries had that. That's the Soviet Union did that in the 80s, and that ended up being their Vietnam, but way more impactful and leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Lasting 6 months longer. The war dramatically hurt the reputation of the United States. It hurt the United States quite a bit too. Today, the Vietnam War is seen as pointless, a big freaking mistake based on lies that led to millions of innocent people dying. It was a civil war that many say the United States had no business being a part of. Unlike the Korean War, the United Nations wanted nothing to do with it. Most of the world refused to help the United States at all. It left more than 58,000 Americans
are on their own,
dead,
basically.
and another more than 153,000 wounded. Many of those veterans who survived suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's one of the saddest things too, is how our infrastructure was so bad for these returning soldiers with their physical and mental problems now about how they were just hung out to dry, right? You know, the stereotype of the Vietnam War vet in his jacket from the military, muttering to himself incoherently on a public street corner, begging for money. And it's like so sad.
These vets often came home ignored, sometimes even despised. The war was also an environmental disaster. It devastated the forests of Southeast Asia. So many 18, 19, and 20-year-olds died fighting the war that Congress ratified the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. It was only during the 1990s when relations got better between the United States and Vietnam. Today, the two countries are just fine with each other, despite Vietnam still being, quote, communist. Go figure, huh? Look, the United States was not used to losing wars. A smaller and way less powerful country defeating a great superpower such as the US was shocking. It was so demoralizing that the United States avoided getting involved in foreign wars afterward, mostly because the American public demanded that they not get involved.
And then 9/11 changed everything, right? Changed everything when it came to foreign policy.
There's even a term for it, Vietnam syndrome. Only after 9/11 did that finally change, and even then, the American government at least attempted to avoid sending ground troops. Oh, and it didn't reinstate the draft. Needless to say, I didn't join the military after high school. Only recently did I realize that a big reason why I didn't volunteer for the military was because of my obsession with the Vietnam War when I was 18.
That is interesting to think about. As one of the effects of the Vietnam War was, and I don't know what the numbers are like, but for voluntarily joining the armed forces, you know, taking a significant hit after Vietnam, because obviously if you volunteer for it, you're definitely going to be thrown into a war. So has that war, the legacy of the war, decreased army and you know, whatever, military enlistment because of getting involved in a war that many might feel that they might get thrown into, that they're going to disagree with?
I used to watch. I didn't want to get stuck in a jungle somewhere, constantly afraid of being ambushed. I didn't want to shoot and kill random villagers. I think it's safe to say that if I graduated from high school in 1960 instead of 2000, I would have been much more likely to volunteer to serve in the military. But in 2000, I suppose I had Vietnam syndrome. I'm sorry, Dad.
All right, great job on Mr. B covering the main aspects of this war and giving the different events and making sure that they were talked about in a way that showed the cause and effect relationship of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War obviously is not the war to end all American wars, but it did change a lot of things about how politically, militarily, all of that. And you saw it. I mean, laws were passed. It changed, you know, like the voting age, definitely a direct result of the Vietnam War. It also shows too the nonpartisanship of how communism and just that term alone was such a defining factor of the Cold War, and how big of a role it was in the United States, and how largely unified Americans were in the two different political parties about their views about communism and its role in the post-war world. It changed the way that Americans view their government, as we saw with a legacy of distrust is a major effect of this. It also showed the power of the media and access to media, like, again, television being in every home in America by this time, and how these different things are changing the way that societies and their governments interact, and how war is going to be fought in the future. So hopefully you liked what I added to it. And again, I'm going to try to link some other relevant videos as we're wrapping up here. Please support Mr. Beat. Video down below, or video original video link is down below. Support his Patreon channels, channel memberships. If you want to be a channel member from mine, one thing you are going to get is early access to all my videos. Basically, once my video is done and it's published up on YouTube, I'm going to turn that on for channel members, and you'll be able to watch it early before it hits the public. That's one of the best benefits. But again, it does help creators a lot, as demonetization is very common for videos like this. All right, with that, thanks for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time.